Good evening. Good evening. Courtney's over there adjusting. We've had some technical difficulties with our wires this past week, so he's over there adjusting. It's good to see this number out this evening. It's about time for us to get started, so if you'd find you a seat and open up your Bibles to the book of Mark. We are continuing our study there. Appreciate everybody that's tuned in online, but especially appreciate all of you that are here in person this evening as we continue our study, and we'll review for just a second, but we want to get right into what we're going to cover because we're going to try to cover quite a bit of ground this evening. As we're talking about the Gospel of Mark, and the theme in the Gospel of Mark is denying self and letting God reign, and we've noticed last week Jesus' triumphal entry, as we call it, his march into Jerusalem, or his riding into Jerusalem, and all of the people in Jerusalem that are shouting Hosanna to the highest, and they're recognizing the fact that he is the Messiah, but they're really not recognizing what that means. And so they're still thinking in terms of a physical kingdom. They're thinking in terms of that Jesus is going to run the Romans out, and he's going to establish Israel as a world power once again. And of course, the disciples have fallen into that trap. They think that they're going to be large and in charge as part of his cabinet. And so that's kind of the mindset that's going on. But we're building now really towards the climax of the book, with Jesus going into Jerusalem and his ministry time that he's going to have in Jerusalem, that will ultimately end up in his arrest and his persecution and his being put to death, and then of course being buried and raised from the dead. So tonight we're going to try to cover 5 sections that I want to cover all 5 of them for 2 reasons. Number 1, because they really go together, but number 2, because I'm trying to make up for our 3-week hiatus that we had about a month ago when I was sick and we had an ice storm, and then David Shannon came to visit us. But I'm trying to get us to where we can hopefully be done with the book of Mark by the time we start our Wednesday night summer series the 1st of June, and don't have to delay the end of it over to the end of the summer. But having said that, if there's something we cover that you're just really not getting and you really need some help with, please stop me. I'm more concerned that you understand the material we cover than we just cover the material and everybody walks away going, well, that was quick. What was that? So, but that's the plan for tonight. And hopefully you'll kind of see how some of these things fit together. But at the end of class, I'll show you how I think that they all do tie together. But it's basically set up in this fashion where the first thing that we're going to talk about and the last thing we're going to talk about, there's a connection with those. And then the second and the fourth thing, there's a connection with those. And in the middle, there's a section that really ties it all together, that is what they should be seeing that they're not. So let's first of all talk about in verses 11 through 14 of chapter 11 about Jesus cursing the fig tree. And this is one of those accounts in the life of Jesus that as many commentaries as you pull off the shelf is about how many opinions that you'll get over all of this. And so we'll try to talk about it from the perspective of what the book of Mark says, because that's what really matters. But what he's going to do with this is show how he's predicting the destruction of the Jewish system, and the reason why is because they failed to let God reign and rule. So we ended last week looking at verse 11. After the triumphal entry, after Jesus has come into town, this would have been toward the end of the day, he goes to the temple, and it says there that he looked around. And depending on your view of how you're seeing what's going on here is going to determine what Jesus is looking around at. We mentioned last week that this was the end of a ticker tape parade or a big festival. So if you've been at the end of the parade, somebody mentioned last week after class that there's a reason why they put the horses on the back end of the parade. And if you've been around livestock, I don't have to go any further with that, but there's a mess that's left after there's a big parade or a big festival or a fair or something like that. So Jesus is looking around at that, but he's also looking around an area that should be totally devoted to God, but it's not. This should be the best day of Jesus' life. the day that he comes into Jerusalem and everyone is lining the street hailing him as the Messiah. But it has to be such a sad day for him because they're not really understanding or grasping what that means, that he's the Messiah. And so he leaves town. He goes back out to Bethany, which is just, as we mentioned last week, just outside of town. So let me flip down here and show you this really fancy map that I drew for you. You'll notice up in the upper right-hand corner, it's a fancy map. So if you're looking, this would be looking north at a cross-section of what's going on here. You've got Jerusalem up on this high mountain, and on the east side of the city, on the eastern slope of that mountain is where the temple is. And then it goes down into we sang, I think it was this past Sunday, Aaron let us in, maybe somebody else, I don't know. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, well, it's not mountains like we think the Rocky Mountains, but it's big giant hills, and that's all this topography in this area is. So you go down into the Kidron Valley, and then you go up this other hill. On the western side of that hill, coming out of the Kidron Valley, is the Mount of Olives, where this fig tree is going to be. And then when you get over the top of the hill, then you come down towards where Bethany is at. So that's the back and forth, and it's about, I don't know, maybe a mile to a mile and a half journey is all it would have been. So he goes back out to Bethany with the 12. And remember, we've talked about throughout the study that Mark makes a distinction between the 12, the disciples, and the crowds. And so here he is hanging with that inner circle of the 12. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, so he's going, as he has his time of ministry in Jerusalem, he's going back and forth from Bethany into Jerusalem. Now, this was probably for a couple of reasons. Maybe because, it was hard to find in a big crowded city, especially during a feast time. It would have been hard to find accommodations. There wasn't big motel districts in Jerusalem at that time like there is now. But also because Jesus had friends in Bethany. That's where Lazarus and Mary and Martha lived, and so he had someone that he could stay with. And so they're traveling back and forth. He was hungry. Again, one of those little tidbits that gospel writers put in there to remind us that Jesus was 100% man while he was on this earth and felt the same things that we do. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, which is important to think about, that this fig tree was in leaf. They tell me that fig trees start putting on fruit before they start putting on leaves. So if you see a fig tree that has leaves on it, there should already be fruit there on the tree. Now, he's going to talk about later on in the end of this verse, it wasn't the time for figs, but if you're seeing a fig tree with leaves on it, that's a billboard saying, get food here, okay? Especially when you're traveling and you're hungry. It's kind of like going down Interstate 40 and seeing that Cracker Barrel sign with the dumplings and the biscuits and all that, Jared's doing this. You want to pull over, right? One of the hard things about living out west is there's only 2 Cracker Barrels in the entire state of Colorado. And I don't understand. I just don't understand how you maintain a state with that few Cracker Barrels. But nonetheless, that's what it is. It's a billboard saying, come get something to eat here. So he went to see if he could find something on it, but when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season of figs. So even though this fig tree had the signs that there should have been figs there, there were no figs there. And so, verse 14, he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. So he curses this fig tree, and his disciples heard it. And so you have to think, is Jesus just losing his temper here and really getting on to this tree? Well, that doesn't sound like a very Jesus thing to do, does it? There's a bigger lesson that Jesus is going to show here with these. If you think about as he's coming down that hill, when he gets to the Mount of Olives, where that fig tree is, he's traveling from east to west. As he's looking at that fig tree, what's in the background view? The temple, that's right. In fact, when we were in Israel, I took this picture from the Mount of Olives, and you can see over on the kind of 2/3 of the way over on the right, there's the Dome of the Rock, the Golden Dome Muslim sanctuary there that's been built on top of the Temple Mound that really does, it shows just how visible that it is when you're coming down the Mount of Olives, especially because the temple was on that east side. The eastern wall of the temple and the eastern wall of Jerusalem were one and the same. So that's what you would have seen in the background, and especially when you think about how it dominated the entire city view there. This is when you go to the Museum of Jerusalem, right outside the Museum of Jerusalem, they have a 1:50 scale model built of what Jerusalem would have looked like in 66 AD. So basically what it would have looked like when Jesus was alive on the earth. It takes up 22,000 square feet. So it's a big model, and you can see the path where you can walk all the way around it. But just from this scale model, you can see how that the temple was such a massive structure that would have, as you're walking, that's the first thing you would have seen. As you're walking down that hill, that's what would have been ever present in front of your eyes. And so Jesus is seeing this fig tree, but on the back side of that, off in the distance, he's seeing that giant temple up there. Jared?
So what we're seeing basically in the middle of the picture, is that the Kidron Valley?
Yes. Going down that hill, you can kind of see all of this like gray area over here on this left side over here. That they've turned all of that coming down from the Mount of Olives into a giant cemetery. So but they bury everyone in mausoleums on top of the ground. So it's become just this giant hillside cemetery. But then you get to the bottom and there's a little brook that runs down through there, and then you climb the hill where you can see the gray concrete walls going up. So
I think a lot of times when we think of valleys, we're thinking of these massive valleys, and we wouldn't necessarily call that a valley.
No, it would be because the mountains aren't what we think of mountains really either. But the valleys would have been enough when you're talking about an era of hand-to-hand combat and bows and arrows. That would have been a mighty defense system that they have to climb those walls to get there, which is why the majority of the time the way Jerusalem was taken was by siege. They would just cut them off, and when they run out of supplies and weakened them, then they could attack or whatnot. So that's what Jesus is looking at. So think about, as Jesus knows what he's fixing to do. He was at the temple the day before. He sees this fig tree that has all the signs that's showing and saying, I have fruit, but it has none. And in the background is the temple where he was at the next day that has all the signs of, we have fruit, but they had none. And it's run by chief priests and scribes and elders, which we're going to talk about them some more here in just a few minutes, that they've got the right clothes on, they walk around in the right way, they're doing the right things and saying the right things, they're showing signs that they have fruit, but they have none. And so what Jesus is trying to show them is the fact that this is all going to come to an end. Now, hold your finger there and flip over in your Bibles to chapter 13. In chapter 13, verse 28, he says, Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and put forth its leaves, you know summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see these happenings, recognize he's near right from the... What's the parable of the fig tree? Well, the fig tree... I don't know that he really taught a parable about the fig tree, but he's telling them this is teaching you a lesson. What was Jesus? Everywhere he's gone in Mark, he makes the point that everywhere he went, he's gone teaching. And so he's teaching here. This fig tree is teaching a lesson in that, you know, you can have the right signs, you can have the right clothes, you can have the right leaves, you can say the right things or be in the right place. But if you're not producing the fruit that you ought to, then you're as good as dead. And so that's the point that Jesus is getting to, and we'll come back to the fig tree here in just a minute. Then you get to verses 15 through 18, and you have Jesus driving the money changers from the temple. And he's going to, in essence, what he's doing is removing those Jews who were not letting God reign. So they came to Jerusalem. That was Jesus and the 12. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables and the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. So, a couple of things. When you come to Jerusalem, and people traveled for men did, the three main feasts that they would come to Jerusalem for, and at other times of the year as well. And when you travel to a foreign country, those of you that traveled, one of the first things you want to do is what? What do you need to do when you go to a foreign country? You need to change your money, right? Now, the worst place that you can change money is at an airport. That's the first things when you start traveling internationally that they'll teach you, is that in the airport, they're going to take advantage of you. They're not going to have the ratios like they should. So wait till you get out of the airport into the city to a legitimate banking source, that type of thing. So when they would come to Jerusalem, they would do some money changing. But then the other thing that went on was, especially if you're traveling from a large distance, you didn't have to bring your sacrifice with you that you were bringing. You could actually buy there at the temple, you could buy some, whatever it was that you needed to buy to sacrifice to the Lord. And in and of itself, there was nothing wrong with that. In fact, I've got listed on there Leviticus 5:7, chapter 12, verses 6 through 8 of Leviticus. All of that is, God's okay with all of that. It's interesting, though, that he points out specifically those who sold doves, because Leviticus talks about how that was the sacrifice that the very poorest would make, is the doves. And so Luke 2:24 really emphasizes this, but in a lot of extra biblical writings from ancient Israel, what you find out is what was going on was they had a hook and crook system going on. So I get to, and the doves the pigeons pointed out, because this is the very poor. That's who they would usually take the advantage of the most. I would come to the temple, and I'm very poor. I want to make a sacrifice, so I go to Jared, the pigeon salesman, and he sells me a pigeon. And I've got my little amount that I have that I buy my pigeon from him. Well, then I go into the temple, and I'm ready to make my sacrifice, and I go up to priest Johnny Shanklin, and I say, here's my pigeon. And he says, where'd you get this pigeon from? And I say, Jared. And he says, oh, you can't buy your pigeons from Jared. He didn't have good pigeons. You need to go buy your pigeons from Jeff Capps. And Jeff and Jared are in cahoots with Johnny so that they can all sell more pigeons and they can scrape a little money off the top. And in the end, who ends up getting hurt is me, the poor guy, trying to just simply buy something to give to the Lord. And the Lord, because he's entrusted these men to be servants. And who are they serving? Themselves. They're showing signs of fruit, aren't they? There's lots of leaves, but there's no fruit to be found. Yes, sir.
What would be comparable to that today in 2022 in the churches, in the religious community now? Those money changers and those people compared to that today?
Well, I think could be a lot of things we could make comparison to, but anytime we're doing something for show, but it's not really what we ought to be. Jesus has already told the chief priests and the rulers in the religious world that I desire mercy, not sacrifice. When we put, and I'm not saying there's things we've got to do, we can book chapter and verse and all that, but one of the things that we got to make sure that we're not guilty of is doing the right things in the right ways, but not for the right reasons. We can come to this building and we can never use a piano. We can never let a woman preach and never worship God. We can sing every song a cappella and never worship God. We can preach sermons we can book chapter and verse every point and never worship God. If we're doing it just for show, see. If we're, what they would do a lot of times too, that Jesus is fixing to really get on to them about, is the fact of, I know God doesn't say this, but I think we should, okay? And then Danny says, well, I don't agree with that. I don't think, it doesn't matter because I'm in charge and we're going to do it this way. And if you don't do it this way, you're a liberal, Well, that's what they did. All of these things that were for a show, not only to make it look like that they were ultra-religious and really loved God and were so righteous. That's why when Jesus starts the Sermon on the Mount and he gives the thesis statement about halfway through chapter 5, about verse 21-ish or so, and he says, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you'll not enter the kingdom of heaven. Everybody that heard that would have went, how can our righteousness exceed the Pharisees' righteousness? They were the epitome of righteousness because they wore their Pharisaical clothing, because they wanted to be set apart. They walked around together and expected the waters to part for them. They wanted everyone to look up to them and think of how holy they were. And yet, there was so much of it that I'm just concerned about being in authority, not letting God reign, but I want to reign. Yes, sir.
And could it be kind of like the prosperity preachers, about money, prosperity, instead of being saved? And could it be about church like being caught up into politics, Republican Party, Democratic Party, rather than what you're saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that, I think, especially is going to be more in the conversation he's going to have with them a little bit later on, because he's going to, with the disciples, he's going to talk about whatever you ask, if you believe, he'll give it to you. And people have twisted that to meet some of those points that you're pointing out right there as well. All right, so he runs them out. By the way, usually when we see Jesus portrayed in movies and whatnot, he's very, very soft and he's walking around like this. And this is not an unmanly moment here that Jesus is going in and running these guys out. But he said he wouldn't allow anyone to carry anything through the temple, and he was teaching them, which is what Jesus is always doing, and saying to them, is it not written, my house? And this is written in Isaiah 56 and verse 7. My house. Whose house is the temple? God's house. The Pharisees and the scribes and the elders thought of it as whose house? Their house. Now, you're talking about how this applies to us. At my church, or, eldership sometimes will at my church, or preachers will sometime at my church, and I want things to go the way I want to go. It doesn't matter what I want. It's God's church, not mine. My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations. And then he quotes Jeremiah 7 and verse 11, but you've made it a den of robbers. Which is interesting because if you go to Malachi chapter 1 and verse 13 and chapter 2 and verse 10 and chapter 3 and verse 18, the last prophetic word that God gives to the children of Israel before 400 years of silence, there's lots of things that he really deals with the people in Malachi. But primarily, the biggest problem that they had was the fact that they weren't giving the way that they ought to, that the priests weren't offering the sacrifices like they ought to, and their heart was far from the Lord because it showed in the way they gave and the way they sacrificed, the way these men served. And then God gets on to them for that and then doesn't talk to them for 400 years. You would have thought about year 250 or so at least, somebody would have said, maybe he thinks that's important, If my wife gets on to me about something and then doesn't talk to me, it's only going to take me a couple of days to realize she really was serious about that thing there, wasn't she? 400 years has gone by and they're still doing the same things that they were doing all the way back in the days of Malachi. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it. They were seeking a way to destroy him. Now, we've seen this before, This word is not the word that when they get ready to decide they're going to kill him, that's not what this word means. They're not to the point yet that we have to kill him. This word means to ruin the reputation of, or to bring someone down in their standings, or to make it to where they have no effect at all. So they're not to the point of we got to kill him yet, but we've got to do something about it. And the reason why was because the next prepositional phrase, for they feared him. So we got to do something about what. Why is it that they fear him? Well, he tells them in the next statement, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching, which has happened every time Jesus teaches. So here's the problem. They fear him because, and I've got the list there in orange there, he has shown boldness. He walks right in the temple, and he doesn't, like the rest of them to do, would walk up to the priests or the scribes or the elders and say, Priest Jared, is it okay if I throw these money changers out? He just walked in and did it. He was bold in what he did. Number two, because he has power with the people. They're afraid because the people, just yesterday, they're saying this is the Messiah. They're lining up to follow him. They're amazed at the way he teaches. And so we don't just have Jesus to contend with, we have the people to contend with. And more importantly, the problem with that is that if if the people are following Jesus, then who are they not following? Us. And that's a big deal there. And then number three, because of what he's done. He's just come into our house, which is the way they viewed God's house, our house, and done this thing without our giving him permission to. So we've got to do something about him. We have a Jesus problem. And so when evening came, they went out of the city. Then you've got verses 19 through 26 where Jesus, after he goes out of the city with his 12, now he's going to teach them about faith and forgiveness. So remember, we go into town in the morning, we go through the Mount of Olives, we curse the fig tree, we get into town, we go to the temple, we turn the tables over, have the discussion there, and then we come back out. And then verse 20, as they passed by in the morning, they saw the fig tree when they're coming back in. The next day, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. It's dead. And Peter remembered and said to him, and this is one of those moments where you just look at Peter and you say, bless his heart. He means so well. Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look. This is an interjection, which is a word of surprise. So Peter is saying, Rabbi, wow, that fig tree you cursed died. Yeah. Are you surprised at that? That's like saying, look, that bag of Oreos you set in front of Corey and Jared is gone. That's what we do. That pot of coffee that you put in front of Corey and Jared is gone. Would any of you be surprised? Especially if you had the pot of coffee and the bag of Oreos. I'm getting hungry now all of a sudden. Anyway, that's what he's doing. Wow, you cursed a fig tree and it died. I'm amazed. The fig tree that you cursed has withered. And Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Wait a minute, I thought we were talking about fig trees dying, and you're talking about having faith in God. But that's the theme that you're going to see. Notice in verse 23, does not doubt in his heart. Verse 23, believes. You get to verse 24, believe. He's talking about the faith. What does that have to do with it? Well, you need to trust in God's power. If you get that, remember, Peter's the one that said, you are the Christ. You're the Messiah. You're God the Son. You're the one that's been promised to us. And then he's saying, I'm shocked that you can curse a tree and it wither away. Because he gets that he's Messiah, but he doesn't understand that means that he's God sent in the flesh to die for him. You've got to trust in God's power. Jesus says, verse 23, truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. You remember back in chapter 9 and verse 29 when we're talking about when Jesus and the three came down from the Mount of Transfiguration, and there was the boy that had been brought that was full of the evil spirits, and they said, we couldn't throw him out, and Jesus said, this type can only be thrown out when you ask God. And remember we talked about the point was that they didn't have power. They had been given authority, and then they tried to cast this demon out based on their own power, and they didn't have any power. That's in essence what he's saying here, is when you're trusting in the power of God, you, and this conversation especially is directed more towards the 12 than it is us in general, but what they're going to ask God to do, it's going to be done. Therefore, I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, that you have received it, and it will be yours. So you think about how this has been used, the prosperity gospel, which you mentioned a few minutes ago. Name it and claim it, right? Well, again, you got to think about who he's talking to. He's talking to the disciples, the 12, that are going to be doing some mighty, miraculous deeds by the power of God. But beyond that, if you understand what he's really saying here, that idea of asking is the idea of seeking something, an inferior seeking something from a superior. So those of you that have been in the military, when you were private first class so-and-so, you didn't walk up to Captain so-and-so and say, I want you to make my bed for me, and if you don't mind, steak and baked potato for supper. That's not the way the military works, is it? When you're talking to your superior, you're going to ask things that you know your superior will allow you to ask of him, right? And then that second word, prayer, is just a request that's made to deity. So understand, this is not giving you the right to just go. He's not saying God is a genie that you can rub the lamp and command him to do whatever you want to. I want a brand new Z71. I want a brand new bass boat. I want a trip to Hawaii. God, I believe you're going to do it, so let's get it. Let's get it. That's not the way this is understanding that you're denying self and letting God reign. Okay? I'm going to be asking things that are in accordance to his will because he's the superior and I'm the inferior. And he says, and when you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you of your trespasses, which is another reminder that when I'm praying and I'm asking and I'm requesting, my prayers shouldn't be about me. They should be about others, right? So forgiving others. Now, verse 26, some of you will have it in your Bibles, and it may have a bracket around it or something like that. We've noticed a few of these other verses. This is the Metzger book that I've showed you before that gives the omitting of this verse an A rating, and it says that probably it was added by a scribe to imitate Matthew 6:15. So it's in the Bible. It's just not here, so we're going to observe the Passover on that and skip on down to the next section. Verse 27 through 33, the chief priests and scribes challenged Jesus' authority. And so when they came again to Jerusalem, as he was walking in the temple, so you've got this going in and out of the city every day, and as he does so, there's these conversations that take place. And now as he's back in the city, he walks in the temple, and think about how differently it would have looked on this day as opposed to the last time when Jesus is there throwing all the people that are in cahoots with each other out. It would have been a different looking temple for sure. It says the chief priests and the scribes and the elders came to him. Now, if you flip back to chapter 8 in Mark and verse 31, you will remember in that key section of the book after Peter makes his confession of who Jesus is, that he's the Christ, and then he tells him that you're not going to go and be put to death, or you're not going to have anything. But notice verse 31, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes. Well, guess what they're doing right now? They're rejecting him. So he says in 8:31, the next thing that's going to happen is they're going to kill me, and I'm going to be buried, and I'm going to be raised the third day. So no one should be surprised at what's going on. Jesus says the chief priests, scribes, and elders are going to reject me, and the chief priests, scribes, and elders come to him, and they're, in essence, fixing to reject him. They ask him two questions. By what authority are you doing these things? And number two, who gave you the authority to do them? Well, number one, by whose authority is Jesus doing this? It's God's, his own authority, because he is God, but he's been given authority by the Father, full authority, see? And the answer to number two, which is kind of implied, who gave you the authority to do them? Because we are the ones in charge around here, and we didn't give you authority to do it. So if we didn't give you authority to do it, you don't have authority to do it. So the two things that they're saying, they don't recognize who he is, and they want him to recognize who they are. Jesus said to them, I'll ask you one question, answer me, and I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. I love this response by Jesus. He says, all right, I'll answer your question, but first, you answer me a question. Riddle me this, Batman. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. Now, every time that the scribes or the elders or the chief priests or the Pharisees or the Sadducees or whoever it was came to Jesus and tried to trick him, you know, it's you're dealing with an unfair matchup to begin with. And so they're trying to trick Jesus. They're trying to get Jesus. They're trying to outmaneuver mentally Jesus. And Jesus says, all right, let me ask you this question. Was John's baptism from God, from heaven, or from man? And then in verse 31, they discuss it. So I see them kind of getting over in a huddle together. You know, they're huddled up and they're, all right, how are we going to answer this? And they basically have two options. They discuss it with one another and say, option one, if we say from heaven, then the result will be, he will say, why did you not believe him? Option two, but shall we say from man, result two would be, they were afraid the people, for they all knew or held that John really was a prophet. You remember whenever Jesus said, who do men say that I am? They said, you're Jeremiah, you're Elijah, you're John the Baptist, or one of the prophets. That they recognized John the Baptist as being a prophet. So here's the dilemma that the chief priests, scribes, and elders are in. If we say that we think it was from heaven, then he's going to say, why didn't you believe him? Why didn't you follow him? Why weren't you disciples of his? And all the people are going to say, yeah, why didn't you do that? But if we say that it's from man, all these people that recognize that John the Baptist is a prophet from God, that what he was doing was from heaven, they're going to turn against us for that. So we can't, either way, we're hung. So verse 31, they answered Jesus, we do not know. What a cop-out. We don't know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you about what authority I do these things. So the deal is off, but he's going to answer this question later on in chapter 12. But Jesus doesn't answer their question, and it's not because he's being childish about this, but he's on a certain timetable, and he's going to follow his timetable. And he's trying to point out and show what it is that they're really about. These are men that are saying, we have the authority, and to a certain extent that's right because God has given them authority, but what have they done with that authority? They've said we're the ones that should be the religious and spiritual leaders, but we don't have enough sense to determine whether a guy that came preaching and baptizing was preaching and teaching what God said or what man said. Now, how are you going to be a spiritual leader if you can't decide that? It also brings up a question that we need to be asking, that you need to be asking when I'm preaching and teaching. Is what Corey's preaching from heaven or from Corey? Because if it's from Corey, it don't make 2 cents whatever I say. What matters is if it comes from heaven. So don't take my word for it. Look at what God says in His Word. And that brings us lastly to the parable of vine growers. We've only got just a few minutes, but this is a terrible chapter break. We've said that a couple of times, but this may be one of the worst of all. It says, and he began to speak to them. And so we're still in the same conversation. The scribes and the Pharisees said, whose authority are you doing this by, and who gave you that authority? Because we're the ones with authority. So now Jesus tells this parable, and the parable is about, and lots of people try to come up with all kinds of allegorical statements. Maybe what does the wall represent? Don't get too deep into this, but think about, if you look at Isaiah chapter 5, verses 1 through 2, and on down to verse 7, you'll see where Jesus is pulling this guy from. But there's a man. The man represents God. He's the one that plants the vineyard. He's later called the owner of the vineyard. He plants a vineyard. The vineyard is Israel. It's the kingdom, okay? He put a fence around it. He dug a pit for it, a wine press, built a tower. He did all the work to establish this vineyard. And then he leased it to tenants. And the tenants are the chief priests, the scribes, and the elder. And the owner went off into another country. When the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get some of the fruit. So who did God send to the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes? Well, they sent prophets. And it says they took him and beat him up and sent him away empty-handed. Well, that's what Ezekiel 34 tells us. When you look at Stephen's sermon in Acts chapter 6, that's exactly what he says you've done to every prophet, is you beat them and you ignored them and you killed them. They took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. He sent another servant, another prophet. They struck him on the head, treated him shamefully. He sent another prophet. They had him killed, and so with many other prophets, many others. Some they beat, some they killed. But he sent so many, it shows how patient that the owner is, right? After the first prophet, after the first servant was sent, he didn't just wipe them out. He kept sending prophets and kept sending servants and kept sending servants. And then finally, he still had one other, a beloved son, which is what God called Jesus in chapter 1 after his baptism, which is what God called Jesus in chapter 9 on the Mount of Transfiguration. This is my beloved son. He had one, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, they'll respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. Is that the way inheritances work? That if I kill the son and the dad's still alive, that I get to inherit it? Is that the way it works? Only if I think I'm the authority. Somebody saying something? Only if yes, ma'am. Yeah. When you think you're the authority for justice, which is what they thought, then you think you can get by with that. But that's not the way it works. And so they took him and they killed him, which is what they're going to do. They're going to crucify him. Jesus is saying, I know what it is that you're going to do. I know. And they threw him out of the vineyard. Then in verse 9, and you can connect this back to the fig tree, what would the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come and he will destroy, here's our ruin word, the tenants. Why will he do that? Because they're only renters. Jack Ogg's got some property and he rents it to me to grow a vineyard for him that he's planted, and he comes and says, I want some grapes, and I say, you can't have none. How long am I going to be on that property? Not long, Jack said. And give the vineyard to others. Well, who's the kingdom going to be given to? The new leaders of the kingdom will be the apostles and the prophets and then the elders. And so he says, have you not read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. That's a quotation from Psalm 118, verses 22 through 23. And if you remember back in chapter 11 and 9, when he is coming into town in that triumphal entry and they're saying, Hosanna to the highest, that came from the same exact psalm, Psalm 118 and verse 26. But they don't get it. This was the Lord's doing, and it's marvelous in our eyes. And they were seeking to arrest him, but feared the people, that's the word for crowds, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. Now, Jesus told some parables about them, but they didn't get it before. But now they're finally starting to wake up and get it, that Jesus is pointing all this at us. So they left him and went away. So again, you got God is the owner. He has all authority. The vineyard is Israel, or the kingdom. The renters are the chief priests, scribes, and elders. The only authority they have is given to them by God. the servants or the prophets have authority given by God, and then the Son, Jesus, comes. He has all authority because He is God. And it's all about authority. So you think about this section, I know we've covered a lot of territory, but the beginning with the fig tree and the end with this parable that He teaches about the tenants, what He's saying is that ultimately the Jewish system is going to be brought down because you failed to deny self and let God reign. And then He cleansed the temple of those who didn't allow God to reign, and He was challenged by those who would not allow God to reign. In the middle of it all is Jesus teaching about trusting God, not self. Who are you willing to let have authority? God or self? Because if we allow God to have authority, then we're blessed. If we try to steal the authority, then it will mean our ruin. So next week, if you would, read verses 13 through 44, and we'll try to cover that next week. Before we dismiss, I have a few announcements we want to make you aware of, update some that are on our sick